This chapter considers seed plants, and there you see a picture of different kinds of beans, which are actually seeds that are grown within the fruit of a bean pod, which is the actual fruiting structure for plants that are in the bean family. So our first section looks at the evolution of seed plants, and your learning outcomes are to list the evolutionary advantages of seeds. What is it that made seeds an important step and led to the success of plants that produce seeds? And then distinguish between pollen and sperm in seed plants. Now, the seed plants first began to diversify from seedless ancestors about 319 million years ago. And they did evolve from spore-bearing plants known as progymnosperms. There's a group of, a living group of plants called gymnosperms. So these are like before the gymnosperms. You remember that sperm means seed. So they evolved from a common ancestor with this group here. Now, the success of seed plants, which we may refer to as spermatophytes. So this would include the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Their success has to do with the seed and what the seed does for it. The seed actually protects and provides food for the embryo. So it's kind of like the plant world's version of a chicken egg, or a bird egg, or a reptile egg. Now, in that seed is going to contain a sporophyte embryo, the result of an egg being fertilized. And the egg goes through some divisions while the seed is maturing, and eventually a hard seed coat forms around it that waterproofs the seed, and the embryo becomes suspended as far as its metabolism goes, so it goes dormant. It no longer can get oxygen from the outside, so its respiration stops. So that's what's meant by clock stopping right here. And what this does is it buys time for that seed to be moved to a different location from where the parent plant is, and then when conditions are better, can germinate. And that means the metabolism kicks back in. Generally speaking, most seeds are going to require water to begin that germination. But others will require other factors, maybe going through a cold winter. Some even have to go through a fire before germination can occur. And the ultimate situation for the evolution of plants are seeds that are going to be enclosed in tissues that we call a fruit. And the fruit actually is going to enhance the dispersal of the seed. So those would be the angiosperms. Angio means encased. So here the seed is going to be encased in a fruit, whereas gymnosperm, which is part of the word progymnosperm, means naked. Gymnos means naked, so those are naked seeds. They're not going to be in a fruit. So looking at the seed, the embryo is going to be protected by the integument. The integument are going to be a layer of cells from the parent plant that's producing the seed, and so it's described, the integument are described as extra layer 2 of sporophyte tissue. So the parental sporophyte. This integument is going to harden and become the seed coat. So when we look here, the seed coat is identified here. This is an ideal drawing here. So the brown is the seed coat here. And then here, they have it identified as this outer edge here. You can see the embryo on the inside. It has two embryonic leaves called cotyledons, and the body of the embryo here. We're now moving to a group of plants that are going to be referred to as heterosporous. They're going to produce two types of spores instead of just one kind of spore, and you're going to have large spores and small spores. The mega spores are going to be produced in not just a sporangium, we're going to call it a megasporangium. And those are going to divide by meiosis, that's what meiotically means, inside a structure that we call the ovule. And eventually this is going to produce not just a spore, but a megaspore. Okay, so this megaspore then is going to ultimately produce the egg. Okay, so the megaspore is going to be itself is going to be haploid, and then the megaspore will go through some mitosis divisions and produce an egg. Eventually, a sperm, which is going to be produced in a microsporangium. So there are going to be two kinds of spores: megaspores, which produce the egg. Now, a good way to remember that is most of us can relate to the idea that eggs generally are larger sex cells than sperm. Sperm tend to be smaller overall. So megaspore is where the egg is going to be produced, and then a microspore would be where your sperm would be produced. Now, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, it's still the same name, zygote. It's the same in animals as well. Your seed then is going to have the result of that fertilization, which is the embryo. Eventually, the zygote divides into a little multicellular embryo, and then the seed coat hardens, and your embryo goes into metabolic suspension. So it goes basically stops metabolizing and goes dormant. Okay. So there's going to be two kinds of gametophytes, and we were talking earlier in the earlier chapter about the progression of the gametophyte becoming reduced as plants are evolving to go onto land and the sporophyte becoming dominant. So now, when we talk about seed plants, the spermatophytes, these are the familiar trees, the grass that's growing in the lawn, weeds. They're all basically going to be seed-bearing plants, and the sporophyte is very dominant, and the gametophytes are very reduced. In most cases, these gametophytes are going to be made of just a few types of cells, and very, very small, and protected within the sporophyte generation that produced it. So the male gametophyte, so you're going to have female and male gametophytes. The male gametophyte is going to end up producing pollen grains. Okay, so the pollen grain itself is not the male gametophyte itself is the pollen grain. Okay, the pollen grain is going to be produced in the microsporangium. So the microsporangium goes through meiosis, and then the result here is you're going to get a haploid cell. And that haploid cell germinates, just like we do see in the plant life cycle, only produces a couple of different cell types, and there's your gametophyte generation. It's just going to be a little tiny microscopic pollen grain, and that's your entire gametophyte generation. It's so reduced, it's like a couple of different cell types, and that's it. These pollen are either going to be dispersed by wind or pollinators. A lot of times plants evolve with pollinator animals, insects, birds, bats, and water is not going to be needed for this. So when the seed evolved, the pollen grain evolved. And when the pollen grain evolved, there was no need for water for the sperm to find the egg. Instead, the pollen gets carried to where the egg is by wind or by a pollinator. So no water. We've completely moved away from the confines of water to complete the life cycle. In all other cases before we got to this point, water was needed because the sperm had flagella and had to swim to the egg. Here, the female gametophyte is produced in the megasporangium, and so part of that structure overall, we were going to refer to it as the ovule. So within the ovule is where you're going to end up getting the egg produced. So this ovule itself is going to include those couple of layers of integuments that surround it. Okay, and in some cases, in the case of the angiosperms, this structure is going to develop within more tissues that we're going to refer to as the ovary, and that ovary eventually becomes a fruit. Now, this is going to be for the angiosperms, the one in which the seed develops inside more tissue. For the gymnosperms, the ovule is basically going to be naked. Okay, so at any rate, the ovule essentially is your gametophyte. So in the male gametophytes, it's the pollen grain. In the female, the gametophyte is the ovule, which eventually turns through, after fertilization of the egg and the development, will eventually become the seed. It'll either be naked or within a fruit with the extra tissues that surround it Those tissues are from the ovary. So we'll see that when we get to the angiosperms, where the fruit comes from. So there's 5 living phyla, extant phyla of seed plants. They include the conifers, those that make cones, pine cones, like the pine trees, the pine cones. They're called the coniferophyta, which means to, furos means to carry, and conifer, and phyta means plant. And then the cycads, or the cycadophyta, the gnetophyta, and the ginkgophyta. And then there's the flowering plants, the anthophyta. And sometimes they refer to these guys right here collectively as gymnosperms, because their seeds are produced not within a fruit, but basically naked. And then these guys right here, that last phylum is referred to as the angiosperms. In angiosperm, the angios means within a case or encased, so within the walls of the fruit. So these are the groups and their basic descriptions. Here you have phylum Coniferophyta. Sometimes it's referred to as Pinophyta, like the pine trees. And they include pines, spruces, firs, yews, redwoods, which are some of the biggest trees ever. Not ever, but just that exist now. And then there's about 630 species. Now, all of these groups, we just go down the list, they're all heterosporous. They have megaspore and microspore, produced in megasporangium and microsporangium. All of them are going to produce pollen, so none of them require water to get the sperm there. However, some groups do have motile sperm. So here we have non-motile sperm. The sperm is delivered by the pollen, and the pollen grows a pollen tube to take the sperm to the egg. Here in the cycads have a flagellated sperm, but that flagellated sperm is not free to go anywhere. It's stuck within the pollen. Remember, the pollen is the entire gametophyte generation, and that pollen develops just like a gametophyte or any plant would, the gametophyte. And the pollen grows and takes that flagellated sperm to the egg anyway, so no water is needed. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. These look very much kind of resemble palm trees, but palms are flowering. There's about 306 species. The gnetophyta, they're an odd, diverse bunch that are only in 3 different genera. Those 3 genera have 65 identified species. The sperm's non-motile here. Again, all of these groups are heterosporous. This one is interesting. There's only 1 species left of an entire phylum called the Ginkgophyta. And the name of the species is Ginkgo biloba. And it has this characteristic fan-shaped leaves where the veins all run in this kind of like fan-like pattern. And here the sperm are flagellated, and they have separate male and female plants. The entire plant is separate, kind of like we saw with mosses, which is referred to as dioecious. And so this is interesting that only 1 survives today. There's interesting little history given in your lab manual, so you can read about that. There's 300. This is the dominant plant group today, the last one to evolve, the Anthophyta. These are the angiosperms. These are the ones that produce their seeds within a fruit. This is the only group that does that. All the other ones, remember, are gymnosperms. These are the gymnosperms. This is the fruit ones. And so a lot of species in the hundreds of thousands. They include trees, shrubs, vines, and a lot of our foods come from this species here. So it talks about the food that we and other consumers eat. So here we're going to be looking at gymnosperms, which literally translates to naked seeds. And here we are on the cladogram here. We looked at ferns in the last chapter. And here we're looking at your gymnosperms, which include several phyla. And then here are the flowering plants that produce fruit. But right now we'll focus on the gymnosperms. And your learning objectives here to describe the distinguishing features for gymnosperms, and be able to list the 4 groups of living gymnosperms. And in these features, that also includes being able to interpret aspects of the life cycle, the life history of a gymnosperm. And we'll use the conifers or the coniferophytes as an example. So there's 4 living groups. There's the coniferophyta or coniferophytes, the cycadophyta, the gnetophyta and ginkgophyta. These were on that table from the last section. There is no flowers or fruit in this group, like you see in the angiosperms here. the ovule is going to be exposed on a scale, and the scale is just a modified leaf. So, looking at the conifers, they belong to the taxon, which the phylum is Coniferophyta. There you see that phyta again, which references the plant. And the conifers are probably the most familiar gymnosperms because of the pine cones. They include pines, spruces, firs, cedars, and others. You have some of the largest living vascular plants. They include the coastal redwood and the giant sequoias, and then the oldest living ones, the bristlecone pines that have been aged to be in the thousands of years old and still living. They tend to live in cooler and drier climates, and they have adaptations for that. Conifers are also sources of important products. They produce softwood, lumber, paper, resin, and even drug materials like Taxol, which is used for anti-cancer. And then, so looking at pines as a specific kind of conifer, there's 100 species. So there's more conifers than just the pines, but this one is called a loblolly pine. These are all found in the northern hemisphere. They produce these needle-like leaves, these thin little leaves. So you think about the holiday trees or Christmas trees you bring in to the home, or have that kind of structure for their leaves. The leaves have a thick cuticle, and the stomata, which open and close to allow gas exchange, they're kind of recessed or hiding deeper deeper inside the leaf itself, which helps reduce even more the water loss. So the pine needle, the leaves on there are actually adaptations for drier situations. If you talk about a winter, during winter, deciduous trees will drop their leaves, and one of the reasons for that is to prevent too much water loss. The days are shorter, so they tend to just drop their leaves and go dormant as far as photosynthesis goes. But pines will keep their leaves during that time. And where's the water? Well, the water may be tied up in snow above ground, so there may be little water under that snow. The leaves themselves have canals called resin ducts, and resin is a substance produced by the tree that can help deter insect and fungi from attacking the plant. So for pine reproduction, there's a lot of terms in here, including the idea of the micro and megaspores that we talked about in the last section here. Remember the gametophyte? The entire gametophyte is going to be a microscopic pollen grain. The pollen is so small you would see better seeing it with a magnification. It is the entire gametophyte generation. It's so reduced. They're going to develop from microspores in male cones, and the spores are produced like spores are always produced in plants by meiosis. The female pine cones tend to be on the upper branches of the same tree. So if you've got male and female cones on the same tree, then that would be monoecious instead of dioecious, like we introduced in the last section, the terms. The female cones tend to be bigger, larger, and the scales are woody. So the scales, where the ovules are, and eventually produce the seed, are on there, naked on the base of the scales. So typically for a pine, you'll have 2 ovules, although you can have more ovules depending on the kind of conifer. And these are going to be produced. The ovules are going to be the structures produced as far as it goes for the name of the sporangium is the megasporangium. Another name for that is the nucellus, and it's basically naked on the base of the scale. Now, one of the reasons to have the female scales up on top is because pine trees and the conifers, the pollen is wind pollinated. So you don't want the pollen cones being up on the top. If the pollen gets released by the cone, it's going to fall downward because of gravity. So instead, the pine is adapted to be released. It has little wing-like structures, and when the wind carries it, it'll carry the pine pollen upward to the next tree further down. So that way it promotes cross-fertilization between 2 different plants. So the details of pine cone reproduction are on here. Lots of key terms. I'm just going to go scan through this and underline keywords, and then we're going to go straight to the diagram to explain this. So the nucellus is where the ovule is produced. It's going to be surrounded by integument. The integuments are going to have a little opening where the pollen tube will enter. So this is the female part. The male is the pollen gametophyte. The pollen will go in through there. It's called the micropyle. So that's a key term to know. The integument ends up forming the seed coat from those integument layers, so it will form that seed coat. So these are all vocabulary items that you'll see pop up if you're going to describe the life cycle. There's going to be one megaspore mother cell that's produced, and another name, just like earlier, a spore mother cell. We call it a sporocyte. This can also be called the megasporocyte. That's the same as megaspore mother cell. Okay, so the megasporocyte is going to form within the megasporangium, and then it's going to divide by meiosis to form 4 megaspores. And it's by meiosis. 3 are going to degenerate, and only 1 is going to develop into the female gametophyte. So 3 of the cells that are produced from meiosis break down and go away. So that's something to remember. Now, the female gametophyte, I mentioned 2 is common for pines, but there could be up to 6. And remember, some of the terms still apply, where the egg is going to be produced within that gametophyte. So the gametophyte is the ovule, and these structures are roughly going to be quite small for the female, and some magnification will be required to see it well. So these are small, entire gametophyte generation, and within there, we can identify where the egg would be produced. So we could still refer to that as the archegonium. So there'd be 2 to 6 archegonia in there, and each archegonium would produce an egg, right? So just like we saw in the lower plants. Now, where is this located? It's within the ovule. The ovule is basically roughly what's going to become the seed. So we're talking about a small structure in there, and then an even smaller structure that leads to the production of the egg. So let's take a look at the life cycle here. And so you got your ovulate cones. This is another name of saying the seed cones, where the seeds would be produced, is the female cones. And then your male cones are also called the pollen cones. And sometimes they're called the staminate. So we'll just put that down there because the diagram misses that. So the pollen cones, they're also called the male cones. Male cone, pollen cone. This is the female cone. Female cones are larger. Now, the cones themselves are basically a stem, and they're going to have scales that go in a whirl pattern around the main central stem. So you're going to have these scales going all the way around that stem. And so these scales are kind of like modified leaves. And then at the base is where your sporangia would be, your megaspore and your microspore. If you're the male cones, it's the microsporangium. And your female, it's the megasporangium. And so these are going to be at the base of the scales there. And for the male cones, they're much smaller. They're located lower on the tree. The female cones are higher up on the tree. And so we can follow both of them as they go through meiosis. So here, when it comes to the male cone, at the base of the scales that are all growing along the cone, you may probably have seen pine cones before. The male cones are much smaller. We're used to, the ones you probably see are the larger female cones. They have really hard scales. So at the base there, you would have your microsporangium, and in there you're going to have microspore mother cells. We can also call those microsporocyte, just like spore mother cell, sporocyte. And so within there, each one of those would go through meiosis. So that's going to be 2 divisions. And by the time you're done, you're now, those nuclei are now haploid. Right, so now we're on the haploid side of the line here. This is that line dividing the 2 generations. And each one of those cells is going to go through a development to produce your pollen grain. Your pollen is the gametophyte. This would be your entire male gametophyte generation. The gametophyte for these more advanced plants has become so reduced it's a microscopic pollen grain. These little air bladders are going to help capture wind so that when they get carried away to the next tree and carried upward, they can go and land in the female pollen cones. Now, the pollen grain itself lands on the female cone and then will begin to develop just like any multicellular plant would, and part of the development would be to grow and develop this pollen tube that will deliver two sperm in there. So before that's the case there's going to be only two major nuclei in there within the pollen grain. One of them is the pollen tube nucleus, or the tube nucleus, and it's in charge of developing the nucleus, the tube, the pollen tube. The other one, the other nucleus, is the generative nucleus, and it divides by mitosis to produce two sperm cells. So there you can see there's two sperm cells there. Now, all of this is described on the slides before and after this, so we're just looking at it in image here. You can see the two sperm that have been produced by the generative cell and the other cell that's directing the development of the pollen tube. Okay, so let's come back over here and go back to the female cone, and at the base of each scale, you're going to have, in a pine tree, a pine species, you're going to have two megasporangia at the bottom, where the ovule will be produced. Remember, they also use the term nucellus, so you may see that as labeled in the diagram. The nucellus includes some of the extra tissues that are associated with it. This is at the base, and then this is the rest of that scale. This part right here is what's attached to the central stem down here. So this would be the base right here. That little opening right there, there's that opening again. You see that opening there? That's the micropyle. That's the opening in the integuments. These are the integuments. The integuments would end up becoming the seed coat after fertilization. Now, a lot of this process is going to take place over 2 seasons, so we're talking about at least 15 months of development, especially when it comes to the development of the female gametophyte. So let's start back over here. You're going to have your megaspore mother cell, which is also called a megasporocyte. Okay, same thing, microsporocyte, megasporocyte, we're heterosporous. So within there, that megasporocyte goes through meiosis, and meiosis always leads to 4 haploid nuclei. So there you see the 4 cells that are resulted from the 2 divisions of meiosis. But you can see in the image there, just like mentioned on the slide, 3 of them degenerate. Okay, and then this one cell here will divide and form by mitosis and form 2 eggs. Okay, so while this development is occurring, and this happens quite slowly, the development of the female gametophyte, going from here to here is going to take at least a whole year to get there. Okay. Meanwhile, the pollen has already been released early on and landed at the base of the cone, and the cone continues to develop. And while that's occurring, this pollen tube is growing inward, and it's digesting some of the tissue, and the pollen tube is trying to make its way. See, here's your pollen has landed in there, the micropyle. We've already had pollination. You can see the little pollen there, and the pollen tube starts to go through some of the tissue of the nucellus, which is all part of that the ovule structure in there, digesting its way. And by the time it gets to where the position of the egg is going to be, the entire female gametophyte that's in there has matured. Okay. And what's happening is that pollen tube is taking the 2 sperm, which don't have flagella. It's taking the 2 sperm there, and only one of the sperm is going to fertilize one of the eggs. Okay. And so that occurs there, and only one of the eggs gets fertilized. The other one degenerates away. Only one sperm fertilizes. The other sperm cell degenerates for that one pollen grain. And you end up with one diploid zygote in there. Okay? The rest of the cells that were part of the ovule are going to serve as nutrition for the nutritional source for the embryo. At this point here, the zygote is going to go through some divisions by mitosis and differentiation to form the different cells of the embryo that's in there. When the embryo is fully developed, the seed coat is now hardened and the embryo becomes dormant, and it waits for the right conditions and hopefully to be carried away from the parent tree. Your pine seed will look like this. This is the seed in there. It'll have that little wing, which was part of the scale. It's not completely all of the scale. So this is part of that structure there. And it can get carried by wind or by an animal to another location. And if it doesn't get eaten by an animal, the seed can germinate somewhere else. Here's your seedling. And all of these cells are diploid, and now you have your mature sporophyte generation all over again. And so that's roughly the life cycle. And you see you're alternating between a sporophyte over here, very large, very dominant part of the life cycle, to a very, very reduced gametophyte generation. So you're still alternating between your haploid generation, all of the cells from here that are part of the female gametophyte, they're all haploid. Okay? Just like the cells that make up the pollen grain are all haploid. That's your entire plant. They're very reduced microscopic. Okay, we still alternate generations. So we were describing the female gametophyte. The rest of the slides are going to continue to describe what you saw here in this life cycle. You want to study it and make sure you can interpret where meiosis occurs, where fertilization occurs, what some of the major terms are, like megasporocyte, microsporocyte, and the teguments that become the seed coat. All of that stuff is things to know. Okay, so the fertilization, all of this is going to take a while here, so that the female pine cone is going to take 2 or more seasons to mature. So the process is very long, at least 15 months, 21 months or so, almost 2 full years. During that first spring, when the mega gametophyte is going through its development, pollen has already been released and drifted in there. The pollen grains are going to be fall into the base of the pine cone and get trapped down in there, and then the scales kind of close up on the pollen that's in there. By the full year after that, the female gametophyte finally matures, and that pollen tube has made its way as described when we were looking at the picture there. Now remember that the male gametophyte, that pollen grain, is carrying 2 sperm, but only one fertilizes the egg. And this is going to be a big difference with the angiosperms, because the angiosperms and both sperm are going to play a role. So keep that in mind for now. Here, only one sperm is going to do the job, and that's it. Okay. So 15 months after pollination, and pollination is not the same as fertilization. Pollinization is when the pollen grain lands in the base of there, and your pollen is landed in there, and the pollen tube starts to grow. That's pollination. Fertilization doesn't occur until the sperm actually makes it to where the egg is, and the egg gets fertilized. Okay, so again, it can take 15 or more months for all of this process to occur. Again, only one sperm fertilizes, the other one degenerates, fades away. Okay, so now looking quickly at some of the other groups, we're not going to go into their life cycles, but you can imagine it would be somewhat similar. The pollen has to get to the female cones, or where the female ovules are going to be, where the egg is there, as developed in the female gametophyte. These are cycads. They belong to the phylum Cycadophyta. A lot of times you see these in landscaping. A very, very popular kind is commonly called the sago palm, but it's not a palm tree. It's a cycad. It belongs to the phylum Cycadophyta. Palm trees are actually flowering plants. They belong to the angiosperms. So again, their sporocytes, remember, resemble palms. They do produce like a large cone here in the middle. Sometimes you'll see them growing a large cone in the middle, and some of the female cones can get up to 45 kilograms. Each kilogram is about 2 2/10 pounds. So it's you're talking that 100-pound thing. That's large, right? Another interesting little side note is that the sperm cells that are in the pollen grain are some of the largest in terms of cell sizes, if you were to measure the size of the cells. Then we have the Cnidophyta. This is an odd variable bunch. There's just 3 genera with some 60 species in there. And something that's unique about this, because remember, we're with the tracheophytes. Since we were looking back at ferns in the prior chapter, we already have vascular tissue. And they definitely have xylem. But when you get to the flowering plants. The flowering plants are going to have an advantage over all of these other seed plants that we are talking about here in this chapter so far. They have an extra new cell type evolved called vessels. So you have the tracheids and xylem, and then you have the vessels. And the vessels have a wider diameter, and they allow more efficient water to travel. So when we say the gnetophytes, these are the only gymnosperms that have vessels. They have this extra cell type within their xylem, and that's unique for all of the gymnosperms. So that's where they're mentioning it in this group here. The three genera are the Welwitschia, Ephedra, and Needham. And I believe this is a Welwitschia species that has a real odd growth pattern there. It's a gymnosperm. Okay? And then you have that one group, the Ginkgophyta, the phylum. We call them Ginkgophytes. There's only one species left in the world today. It was discovered in an ancient garden in Asia, I think, somewhere within China. And it's a gymnosperm. It almost looks like they produce fruit, but the ovule is going to be, as it develops, is going to be naked. And ultimately, it's considered not a flowering plant, but a gymnosperm. These are the ones that have those fan-shaped leaves. And this one's a female. The seed is kind of surrounded by a tissue-like coating, so it doesn't just become a hardened seed coat overall. And the interesting thing about this is the fruit becomes very smelly. I don't know what the function is ecologically for that, if that somehow helps with the dispersal of the seed that's within there. Or not, but they are dioecious, and this plant is used as ornamental, but they tend to only plant the males because the males don't produce the smelly, fleshy seed overall. So those are the ginkgos, and so